In this video, we will talk about language development from birth through the end of toddlerhood, the second year. A couple of key terms that you'll need to be able to distinguish to understand this particular part of the unit has to do with the difference between comprehension and production. So comprehension refers to our ability to understand speech. This is sometimes referred to as receptive communication, being the receiver of communication. Production refers to your use of language to communicate with others. This is sometimes referred to as expressive communication, or communication you use to express yourself. So one of the things that we know about language development is that infants can understand what we are saying to them more than they are able to produce. So before a child is able to speak their first word, they actually understand many of the words that we say to them. And if you've studied a foreign language, you may have picked up on this a little bit yourself, that you can oftentimes better understand what somebody else is saying than you can create your own original statements. And so you may have had that similar experience in a language class. So for the first 6 months of life, we typically call the style of communication the baby engages in pre-linguistic, because this is communication that doesn't really involve words coming. And during those first 6 months of life, we see that children all around the world in vastly different cultures, speaking different languages, or exposed to different languages, I should say, all seem to develop their pre-linguistic skills along the same universal sequence. So everywhere around the world, babies cry from birth. That's their primary form of vocalization. Around 12 weeks, the crying changes a little bit and they start to make some other types of noises, squealing, kind of a gurgly sound, a cooing sound. And that's universal. Those sounds sound exactly the same around the world. Around 16 weeks, you will start to see a little bit of that comprehension I talked about. And so they will respond very differently to human sounds and language sounds than to other kinds of sounds. And you may start to hear them kind of laugh or chuckle. At 20 weeks, their cooing noises start to actually take on some speech-like sounds. And so you may hear what sound like consonants sort of interspersed within there. So maybe a buh, buh, buh in the middle of their cooing. These don't sound anything like actual language. They're just sounds. Around 6 months, they will actually start to do a babbling. And so the babbling will be sort of a repeated single syllable. So it may be like the BA sound, ba ba ba, da da da, ma ma ma, la la la. So something like that. They're not really words. They're not intending those words to mean anything or communicate. And the types of single syllable babbles are somewhat universal. Now, after those first 6 months, we do start to see some differences emerge. So after that 6-month time period, we start to see that the language the child has been exposed to starts to influence the path of development. So the path remains the same in terms of how the skills develop, but the specific words that they learn how to speak and their enunciation of those words and the pitch are all going to vary by the language they've been exposed to. So At 8 months, they're continuing to babble, but you might notice that their babbling starts to resemble speech. So they may start to use intonation, and so their babbling might rise and fall, just like when we're speaking, our voices sort of rise and fall. Around 10 months, you'll see them trying to imitate sounds. So you can say to the baby, ba, ba, and try to get them to repeat it. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. Again, this isn't considered a word because it doesn't have meaning. They're just repeating the sounds at this point. Right around 1 year, the first true word emerges. And so this is a word that has meaning to the child. They are using that word to express something. And most of the very first words are nouns or naming words. So they oftentimes are mama or dada or baba for bottle, but something that is similar to their babbling, but it has a clear meaning to the child. They're also able to respond to some simple directions. And so things like, show me your eyes, and they'll cover up their eyes. By the time they reach 18 months, they have got 30 to 50 words, and from that point forward, their vocabulary grows exponentially. It just takes off. They will also start to create some two-word sort of mini sentences that we'll talk about called holophrases. And they pretty well understand everything that you're asking them. So if you ask them or tell them something, they understand what you are trying to tell them for the most part. So by 2 years, they can name everything in their sort of environment. So they are familiar with, chairs and tables, and if they have a cat, the cat, so they kind of know all of those things. And they're producing a lot of two-word sentences. So after that true first word, which again is around a year, language starts to develop quite rapidly. So the first words that children speak are holophrases. So holophrases are where you have this just single word that can mean an entire sentence. Oftentimes these holophrases include nonverbal information or gestures. So a kid this age may say up and reach their hands up, and what they're saying is, please pick me up. But instead of using all of those words, they just use the word up with the gesture. They also use intonation to ask a question. So they might point to a new animal and say, cat. And what they're really saying is that a cat? But they just say cat with the sort of intonation for a question. Around 2 years old, as the previous slide said, they start to get more two-word sentences, and those sentences show some understanding of syntax, which is the rules for which we put sentences together. They're not great at it. They will still make quite a few mistakes, but they will start to use the syntax, which demonstrates they have some understanding of the rules of language. And so this style of speech has traditionally been referred to as telegraphic speech. In today's world, you might think of it more like texting speech. So one of the great big debates in the world of human development research and theory is, where does language come from? How do we get the language that we have? And there are essentially three competing camps. The first camp is a camp you're very familiar with. Those are the learning theorists, like Skinner's behavioral theory and Bandura's social cognitive theory. And they say that language is like any behavior, and it is shaped by conditioning through reinforcement and extinction and imitation of models. Now, the nativist theories have a different perspective, and you can think of these theorists as more of the nature theorists. And so Chomsky is one of the big theorists in this particular camp. And he basically says that we're kind of genetically programmed to learn language. And in fact, we're born with an innate mechanism in the brain for learning language called the LAD, or language acquisition device. So he says we're kind of automatically programmed to learn language due to just maturation, but that maturation does interact with the environment. And Chomsky would point to the universal processes of language in the first 6 months as one sign of his support for his theory. Also, that kids around the world make similar errors and use similar styles of grammar, even though the languages that they learn are different. Chomsky also would point to different areas of the brain that are associated with speech, such as Wernicke's area, which is used for understanding speech and expressing oneself, so both production and understanding. Broca's area is focused more on language production. The final set of theorists are what we call interactionists, who basically say it's a little bit of both. So yes, there's a genetic predisposition, but the environment, the exposure to language, and the reinforcement for using that language are critical. Another sort of debate in the world of language development is what happens if you fail to develop language on time. So what we know is that language learning is most efficient. We are best at it at 18 to 24 months. This appears to be a sensitive period where the brain is growing in a particular way that makes learning language most beneficial at that point. We also know that children who lack exposure to language and social contacts, or who have malnutrition or abuse during the early phases of life, can have poor language learning, and some of them never quite catch up.